achieve what we couldn't achieve if we were not connected. Another sort of big idea is that we may need to think differently about inequality in our society. And so we're very used to thinking about things in terms of the rich versus the poor, or in terms of ethnicities of, say, blacks versus whites, and trying to think about how is it that we can help people who are in one of these underprivileged classes. And in fact, what our research is suggesting is that the people at the center of the network, the people who are best connected, are actually much better off than the people at the periphery. And so what this means is that maybe we need to start thinking about network inequality and thinking about how to protect those people at the periphery of networks, regardless of whether they're rich or poor, regardless of whether or not they're black or white. In order to be able to make society more equal, we're going to need to give people equal access to the same kinds of resources that they get from their network as people in the center. Another idea that often comes up is this idea of free will. And so if I tell you that there are all these people out there that you may not even know that are having an influence on whether or not you're going to gain weight, whether or not you'll be happy, whether or not you'll be depressed, you may think to yourself, what room is there left for individual agency? And so if it's the case you have all these people out there, you're just like a piece of flotsam sort of flowing on the sea, these ripples on this ocean with waves that are created by all these other people. In the book, we turn this idea on its head. Because while we are influenced by all of these people out to 3 degrees of separation, we also have the capacity to influence those people. And this has played a profound role in my own life. And so after the obesity study, what did I do? I actually lost 5 pounds, and I kept it off. Now, why did I do that? It's because I realized, oh my God, when I lose weight, I'm not just making a decision about myself. I'm making a decision about my close friends and family, and their friends and family, and their friends and family. If you tell someone they can affect 1,000 people with their actions, I think they're going to think a little more carefully about those actions than if they think they're only affecting themselves. And I also have changed my behavior in terms of how I try to make myself a little happier at the end of the day. And so I'm walking along, and sometimes I'm carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, and I'll put on my favorite song. It's not a particularly smart song, but it makes me happy. And I walk in the door, and it probably makes my son a little happier. And these days, now what I realize is that when I do that, I'm not just making him happier, I'm probably also making his best friend happier, and I'm also making his best friend's mom happier. And so it's really fundamentally changed the way I live my life. And I think in some people's reaction to the work that it really changes things to have this self-awareness that we live in these networks and that our actions matter for such a large range of people. And that brings me to my final point, which is that if it's the case that we live in these networks, and if you believe that evolution has been acting on the way we interact with other people, then one implication is that networks must be fundamentally good. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that flows through networks is good. In fact, we open the book with a fantastic story of a murder cascade that happens in Corsica. We talk about pathogens, deadly pathogens like syphilis spreading through the network. We talk about misinformation spreading through the network. Right? So these networks, they do spread bad things as well as good things. But on balance, what we find is that the people at the center of the network tend to be exposed more often to good things that spread through the network than bad things. That on balance, that these connections are actually good for us. Because if they weren't, we would sever those ties. And if they weren't good for anybody, none of us would have these ties. And as a consequence, we really think that not only is it the case that these connections are good, but to really understand our characteristics as human beings, to fundamentally understand human nature, we must first understand how and why we are connected. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for questions now. Oh, wait for the microphone to come.
Well, wonderful book. Thank you for speaking tonight. You left us on a hopeful note with the implications of your research, but again, earlier you said that there isn't any proof that this is going on, and that awaits a clinical trial. For example, taking an obese person, severing their network, and putting them in a group of thin people, and do they change then? Can you give us an update on clinical trials that are really being done like that?
Okay, so the question is, are we doing clinical trials to test some of these ideas about these network effects? And in particular, the question was, what happens when we sever ties from an obese person to a normal weight person? Let me make something perfectly clear. And every time I talk to someone from the media, I make this point, but it often gets lost. Every social connection, every friend, every family member makes you healthier. I know that for some of your family relations that's probably hard to believe, but the evidence is overwhelming. And in fact, in Framingham, in the study that we did, we were able to look at all the people who had a friend who gained weight, who became obese. And we were able to compare the group of people who kept that friend to the people who dumped that friend. And guess which group was more likely to become obese? It was the group that dumped their friend. And so what that suggests is that, yes, it's true that when you keep a friend and when they gain weight, that you're more likely to gain weight. But if you get rid of that friend, you're just going to make things even worse. Because the friendship, the benefit of friendship, the benefit of that social connection outweighs the bad effect that's spreading to you from the fact that their behavior has changed for the worse. So that's one thing. The second thing is we talk in the book about some experiments that we are starting to do in terms of generosity. And so just for example, what we've found where we randomly assign subjects to be in interactions with other people when we were sort of creating the social connections so that there's no chance this can be something that's forming as a result of two people being similar. When I'm generous to you, you're going to be generous to the next person that you are in contact with, and they're going to be generous to the next person that they're in contact with. In other words, what we find in this experimental study is that this behavior also spreads out to 3 degrees of separation and no further. And we talk about that particular outcome in the book itself. The last thing that I'll just say is that I don't think that, that this is rocket science, right? So in some ways we're saying things that people have known for a long time. You know, there were great intuitions by the people who started Weight Watchers when they said that we really need to be doing this in groups. There were great intuitions at Alcoholics Anonymous when they said, well, we really need to assign sponsors to people who are going to make sure that you're following you're following the 12 steps. And so to me, it's intuitive that these effects exist. And so our challenge as scientists is just to figure out creative ways to really show that they actually exist.
This is fascinating. What my mind is trying to wrap here is what I just saw on the news tonight, looking at Chicago with the gangs. I'm thinking of all the good things you're saying, and I'm just wondering if you could, you know, extrapolate this and plop it down in Chicago.
And we actually talk a little bit about this in the book as well. As it turns out, there was an innovative program that was started in Chicago where they would do interventions at the bedside of gang victims. There would be a person there who would be a counselor who would talk not just to the victim, but to the victim's friends and family in order to try and keep one of these cascades from happening. And the program, by all accounts, has been very successful because they understood, again, they had this intuition before they saw the data that we can see it now. They had this intuition that in order to be able to make things better, that they were going to need to intervene at that moment. We also talk in the book about suicide cascades. So this is something that's been around for a very long time. And now there are very strict guidelines, for example, that are given to newspapers about how they report on a suicide because they know that information can change people's minds about its acceptability. And so I think that there are some interventions that are already happening, and we're also starting to think in very creative ways about new interventions that we could make now that we have access to such great data about a wide variety of people. Thank you very much.
Nicholas Christakis is a healthcare policy and sociology professor at Harvard University. In 2009, Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. James Fowler is a political science associate professor at the University of California, San Diego. For more information, visit connectedthebook.com.